Last time we spoke about the South China Sea raid. In January, General Kruger reinforced the American beachhead at Lingayen Gulf, while Admiral Halsey launched Operation Gratitude, targeting enemy ships based on faulty intelligence. Despite not finding the expected battleships, American forces decimated a Japanese convoy, sinking numerous vessels and claiming 113 enemy aircraft. Meanwhile in Luzon, the 1st and 14th Corps advanced against Japanese defenses, capturing key positions despite fierce resistance. As both sides prepared for counteroffensives, the battle intensified, marking a pivotal moment in the Philippines campaign. On January the 17th, the 58th Brigade and supporting regiments launched a daring operation to destroy enemy positions. As American forces advanced, they faced fierce resistance, but some regiments achieved notable success. Task Force 38 executed airstrikes on Formosa and Hong Kong, inflicting damage despite heavy losses. Meanwhile, Japanese forces struggled to regroup amidst American pressure. General Suzuki devised a plan to fortify Leyte, but ongoing air raids hampered his supply efforts. Tensions escalated as both sides prepared for decisive confrontations in the ongoing battle for control. This episode is the Mandalay Offensive. Welcome back to the Pacific War podcast week by week, and I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and my newly titled podcast, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I just released a very long format podcast about the Dutch naval war with Japan. As for Echoes of War, I've released quite a lot of silly episodes for the end of the year. One of them titled, Why the Axis Sucked at World War II. If you'd like to further support me, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either, you get access to the exclusive podcast, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. As we last left off, General Kruger strategically positioned General Mullen's 25th Division on the right flank of the 43rd Division to bolster the assault forces against the Rosario front. This maneuver was intended to facilitate the continuation of the 14th Corps' advance to the south. Following the successful repulsion of General Nishiyama's local counterattack, General Wing ordered the 63rd, 158th, and 172nd Regiments, which had all been stalled, to launch an offensive from the west along the Demortis-Rosario Road. Simultaneously, the 103rd and 169th Regiments were tasked with advancing northwards along Route 3, originating from Posrivio. In contrast, with the 58th Independent Mixed Brigade and the 23rd Division working to contain General Swift's 1st Corps, General Yamashita was reinforcing the San Jose sector. He further instructed the Shigemi Detachment to maintain a defensive position in Binalanon. Although the 27th and 161st Regiments had successfully relieved the 103rd Regiment in the Binalanon area, Major General Shigemi Asio ultimately opted to halt further troop movements. He decided to leave only a small garrison in Binalanon, while the majority of his forces prepared for a decisive stand at San Manuel. As the situation unfolded, the 3rd Battalion of the 161st Regiment encountered minimal resistance, allowing them to advance into the northern half of Binalanon by nightfall on January 17th. In a parallel effort, General Patrick directed the 1st Regiment towards Urdaneta, where they successfully eliminated a small outpost belonging to the Shigemi Detachment. Additionally, he dispatched the 20th Regiment to the Cabaran Hills, where they achieved their objective by reaching Lenek and securing the central area of the hills by the end of the day. On January 18th, the offensive momentum of the 6th and 25th Divisions persisted. The 20th Regiment advanced to a low ridge approximately 2,500 yards west of Cabaran, where American forces identified the primary defenses of the 2nd Battalion, 71st Regiment. Meanwhile, the 161st Regiment successfully cleared Binalanon, and the 27th Regiment moved forward to seize control of the Baktad area, further consolidating their gains in the region. Simultaneously, Wang's units were gearing up for a significant new offensive. In line with this strategy, the 2nd Battalion of the 169th Regiment advanced along Route 3, deftly circumventing the town of Sison, at reaching a crucial road junction located to the northeastern part of the town. Meanwhile, to the north, the 172nd Regiment executed a successful nighttime ambush against a Japanese artillery battalion. Following this victory, they dispatched a company to seize control of a strategically important hill, rising 600 feet and situated approximately 1,000 yards north of Rosario. This position enabled American forces to exert control over a substantial portion of the surrounding area. By the conclusion of the day, the 158th and 63rd Regiments established contact through patrols about a mile south of Amlang, as they prepared for a coordinated assault that was set to launch for January the 19th. This offensive culminated in the collapse of the last Japanese defenses just 2 days prior. Concurrently, the 172nd Regiment successfully established a patrol base on Hill 606. From this vantage point, patrols ventured into Rosario, discovering the town was heavily mined, riddled with booby traps, and defended by concealed machine gunners and riflemen hiding amidst the rubble of the buildings. On January the 19th, the 103rd Regiment initiated an assault on Hill 600, located at the southern edge of the ridgeline east of Route 3. At the same time, the 2nd Battalion of the 169th Regiment faced several intense counterattacks from retreating Japanese forces that had been bypassed at Mount Alava and Sison. Despite the fierce resistance, the relentless pressure from the Japanese troops and increased heavy artillery fire ultimately compelled the battalion to withdraw by noon. Nevertheless, the American operation succeeded in diminishing the Japanese presence in the region. Looking further southwards, the 161st Regiment cautiously advanced towards San Manuel, while the 27th Regiment effectively moved into Asingan, successfully cutting off Shigemi's escape route. Further south, the 1st Regiment rapidly progressed along Route 3 towards the Agno River, capturing the towns of Blasis, Carmen, and Rosales. Meanwhile, the 20th Regiment commenced an assault on the 2nd Battalion of the 71st Regiment stationed over in the Cabaran Hills. On the front commanded by General Griswold, the 14th Corps was in the process of mobilizing along the Camoling-Anio line, preparing to initiate an advance towards the Tarlac-Victoria line. The 160th Regiment began its march, covering 7 miles southwards from Camoling along Route 13, while the 129th Regiment took a strong position in Anao, establishing vital contact with other outposts of the 37th Division stationed over at Pinique. The advances made on January the 20th were notably swift, with the 148th Regiment successfully capturing the towns of Girona and Pura. Meanwhile, the 37th Reconnaissance Troop made significant progress by entering the guerrilla-occupied area of Victoria, and units from the 40th Division advanced to within 4 miles of Tarlac, signaling a promising push towards their objectives. In the area around Cabaran, the Japanese forces had sustained heavy losses during the initial attack. In response, Colonel Patrick made the strategic decision to withdraw 2 battalions from the hills to reinforce the southern advance. Probing slowly through the roughest ground in the Cabaran Hills on January the 20th and 21st, the 20th Regiment's reinforced battalion jumped off in the morning of the 22nd in what was expected to be the very last attack. It was paved by an especially heavy artillery and aerial bombardment. But from the start, operations did not go as planned. The airstrike conducted by the 5th Air Force's A-20s was 4 hours late, subjecting the infantry to a nerve-wracking wait, and did not include requested napalm. Air and artillery concentrations were, however, well placed, and it seemed improbable to the waiting infantry that many Japanese could have lived through them. A combined tank infantry assault began at about 12:30 and proceeded slowly but steadily for almost 2 hours. Then the attackers were stopped cold by tremendous bursts of rifle, machine gun, and light artillery fire from the various hillsides, and they received the full weight of the bombardments. Company E in the lead fell back, Company G's officers were all either killed or wounded, and the company was temporarily scattered. Company F was pinned in place, and the 2 supporting tanks were knocked out. Casualties mounted quite quickly, with 10 men killed and 35 wounded. As a consequence, Patrick found it necessary to redirect 1 battalion from the 1st Regiment to support the ongoing attack. Simultaneously, the remainder of the 20th Regiment pressed forward towards Cayupo, while the bulk of the 1st Regiment continued its eastward movement towards the guerrilla-held Balungao. Additionally, the 6th Reconnaissance Troop reached Cayumba, successfully establishing contact with patrols from the 14th Corps, which was crucial for coordinating their efforts. On another front, with Mount Alava now vulnerable, the 169th Regiment launched a vigorous assault on January the 20th, managing to secure the summit of the mountain by nightfall. In contrast, the 103rd Regiment continued to face heavy casualties during their frontal assaults against Hill 600, ultimately gaining only a precarious foothold on the exposed southern slopes. Meanwhile, in a significant naval development, Admiral Halsey's Task Force 38 exited the South China Sea through the Balintang Channel on January the 20th. The task force was poised to execute further strikes against Formosa, aiming to disrupt enemy operations and bolster the Allied offensive in the region. The following day, with significantly improved weather conditions, Admiral McCain's aircraft carriers launched a coordinated series of airstrikes targeting Formosa, the Pescador Islands, and the southern Ryukyu Islands. These operations resulted in the destruction of 104 Japanese aircraft on the ground, the sinking of 7 oil tankers, and the loss of 7 transport ships, along with additional damage inflicted upon another 7 vessels. For the first time since November of 1944, Task Force 38 felt the sting of kamikaze attacks. Operating just 100 nautical miles east of Formosa, Task Force 38 was not difficult to find. Just after noon, a single aircraft appeared to conduct a conventional bombing attack against Task Force 38.3's light carrier Langley. 1 bomb hit forward. Personal casualties were quite light, but the carrier was conducting flight operations 3 hours later. Within minutes, another aircraft also evaded radar detection and the cap to commence a suicide dive against Ticonderoga. The kamikaze struck the flight deck and penetrated where its bombs exploded. An impending strike was spotted and ready to be launched. Now these aircraft provided with fuel for the fire from which they would be quickly spreading. Just before 1 o'clock, another group of 8 kamikazes and 5 escorts resumed their attacks on Task Group 38.3. Only 2 suicide aircraft survived the cap to dive in on the wounded Ticonderoga. 1 was sent spinning into the water by anti-aircraft fire, but the final attacker crashed into the carrier's island. With this, more fires were started. The crews succeeded in putting out the flames by about 2:15, and they corrected a 9-degree list by about 6 o'clock. Though the ship was saved, the cost was quite high. Some 143 men were killed, and 202, including her captain, were wounded. In addition, their air group lost about 36 aircraft. As a final farewell, the kamikazes attacked the 2 destroyers on the picket duty just 65 nautical miles off Formosa at about 1:10. A single Zero had joined in on the returning strike. Before it could be identified as an enemy, it dove on destroyer Maddox, striking her amidship. This and the explosion of her bomb aboard created a fire that was quickly extinguished. After a final day of strikes on January the 22nd against the Ryukyus, during which 8 ships were sunk, Task Force 38 set a course for Ulithi. Upon arrival, Admiral Halsey transferred command of the Far East carrier force to Admiral Spruance, who would lead the final offensives in the Central Pacific. Meanwhile, back on Luzon, on January the 21st, the 160th Regiment swiftly cleared the town of Tarlac and began their advance towards San Miguel. Simultaneously, the 145th and 148th Regiments moved unopposed towards La Paz. The speed of the 14th Corps' advance had stretched Griswold's supply lines abnormally and exposed his left from Quiapo to La Paz, a distance of nearly 25 miles. He had no definitive information about suspected Japanese concentrations in the vicinity of Capitan, on Route 5 and 50 miles east of La Paz. His worries about the security of his flank were hardly put to rest by reports of new contacts with Japanese forces at Moncada, now 20 miles behind the front, and at La Paz. Elements of the 129th and 145th Regiments easily took care of the Japanese in the Makanda area, but during the night of January the 21st, a pitched battle developed at La Paz when a platoon of Japanese infantry, supported by 1 tank, attacked a 148th Regiment perimeter at a road junction a mile west of the town. The Japanese finally withdrew after destroying a bridge that carried a secondary road across a river a mile east of La Paz, but because of this, Griswold reported to General Kruger that it would be impossible to extend the 14 Corps left any further south until he had more information about the Japanese forces east of La Paz. To mitigate this risk, he decided to keep General Breitler's 37th Division positioned in reserve, while General Brush's 40th Division continued to advance southwards along Route 3 towards Bamban. As a result, elements of the 160th Regiment and the 40th Reconnaissance Troop reached Capas and conducted patrols towards Camp O'Donnell on January the 22nd. Meanwhile, the 161st Regiment began probing the defenses established by Japanese forces under Shigemi. The 103rd Regiment faced severe losses during their assault upon Hill 600, necessitating a withdrawal to reorganize. Concurrently, the 169th Regiment launched an attack upon Hill 355, making slow and costly progress against fierce resistance on a steep and barren slope. By January the 24th, most of Hill 355 had been cleared, allowing the 3rd Battalion of the 103rd Regiment to move in and conduct mop-up operations within the area. As the 158th Regiment looked northwards to secure the area around Amlang, they initiated an eastward push towards the positions held by the 172nd Regiment. However, their advance was quite slow, with only a modest gain of 500 yards achieved. Over the next 2 days, the 158th had faced a grueling battle, making painstaking progress as they advanced foot by foot across exposed hills and ridges, all while enduring relentless machine gun, motor, and artillery fire. It wasn't until January the 26th that they had successfully broke through the Cataguintegan, where they provided much-needed support to the 172nd Regiment's ongoing assaults into Rosario. Meanwhile, by the evening of January the 23rd, the 161st Regiment had managed to secure the southern slopes of the barren ridge north of San Manuel. They established trail blocks in the Aburrito Valley, effectively controlling movement within the area. To the south, the 108th Regiment had taken control of the Capas region, while the 160th Regiment successfully captured Banban. However, it became increasingly evident that the American forces were now confronting the well-fortified and organized defenses of the Kembu Group. The Kembu Group's strength lay in the terrain it held, in depth of its defenses, and within the great number of automatic weapons, aircraft and anti-aircraft it possessed. Its major weaknesses were its immobility, the inadequate training and armament of the bulk of its troops, shortages of food, ammunition, and field artillery, and the rudimentary state of many defensive installations, a state deriving from the last start in establishing the positions at the west of Clark Field. The health of the command was poor from the start, and medical supplies were quite short. Morale was not of the highest order, and many of the troops were easily disaffected Formosans, Okinawans, and Korean labor personnel. In brief, the Kembu Group was the poorest armed, poorest prepared, and supplied of Yamashita's three defensive commands. But on the other hand, as the 40th Division was about to learn, even poor service troops, whatever their state of training and armament might be, can pull off stiff resistance if in good defensive terrain. In preparation for the defense of Clark Field, General Tsukada assembled a diverse array of forces totaling approximately 30,000 troops, although the majority consisted of air and naval personnel. He strategically divided his army units into four distinct detachments. The Takayama, Takaya, and Ikuji detachments were positioned along the first and second lines of defense, facing eastward towards Highway No. 3. Their defensive line extended from the hills west of Banban to the vicinity of Fort Stolzenberg. In contrast, the Yanagimoto detachment maintained its mobile units at Angeles and Parak, ready to respond to any potential enemy paratrooper landings on the southern flank of Clark Field's defenses. Additionally, Rear Admiral Sugimoto Oishi commanded naval units comprising about 15,000 men, tasked with defending positions behind the two forward lines. In light of this formidable opposition, General Griswold made the strategic decision to utilize January the 24th for consolidation and regrouping. This involved preparing for further advances southwards while also probing into the enemy defenses that had already been uncovered. The 160th Regiment was able to secure Leif Hill, although they were unable to establish a foothold on Hill 500, highlighting the challenges that lay ahead. To the north, the American forces initiated another offensive against the Cabaran Hills. The units of the 1st Regiment made only modest progress, yet they managed to advance closer to the main defensive positions as night fell. Meanwhile, at San Manuel, the 161st Regiment launched its first assaults against the Shigemi detachment, which encountered unexpectedly fierce resistance. As a result, the Americans were only able to establish a fragile foothold in the northern sections of the town. Further to the north, Wing directed the 103rd Regiment to set up a line of departure along Route 3, aiming to strike eastwards at the northwestern slopes of Hill 600. At the same time, they were tasked with advancing up the southwestern slopes of the exposed Hill 700 to secure a strategic location, as well as Hill 800 to the northwest. The 169th Regiment advanced to the left of the 103rd. They were assigned to capture Question Mark Hill. Concurrently, the 63rd and 172nd Regiments were ordered to launch simultaneous assaults on Hills 900 and 1500, respectively, while the Reserve 3rd Battalion of the 63rd Regiment was also committed to clear Benchmark Hill. This coordinated attack was scheduled for January the 25th. The initial phases of the assault showed promise, with the supporting forces making significant headway. However, the 103rd Regiment faced considerable difficulties, managing to secure Hill 800 only by nightfall. Notably, the 172nd Regiment achieved tactical surprise, successfully clearing most of Hill 900. Over the next 2 days, the 63rd Regiment regrouped around Hill 1500 in preparation for its own offensive. Simultaneously, the 161st Regiment continued its slow advance southwards towards San Manuel, facing intense opposition. Patrick's units on the Cabaran Hills managed to gain a mere 300 yards against determined resistance. Meanwhile, Brush pressed his attack upon Clark Field, with the 160th Regiment clearing Hill 500 and advancing nearly a mile along the ridge from Leif Hill, while the 108th Regiment secured Hills E and G. The following day, the 40th Division continued its southward maneuver. Any movement by American troops along the generally open ridges west of Route 3 inevitably brought down Japanese machine gun and mortar fire, often augmented by fire from dismounted aircraft automatic weapons, anti-aircraft guns, and light artillery. Seeking cover and usually pinned in place, the American infantry would call for close-in motor and artillery support, wait for the concentrations to be fired, and then drive forward a few yards, when the process had to be repeated. Each time, the Americans managed to overrun a few Japanese machine gun or rifle strongpoints. There was little choice of routes of advance. Draws providing some concealment in scrub growth or bamboo thickets were usually covered by well-placed Japanese weapons, both within the draws and on the ridges to each side. Possession of the high ground, as ever, was essential. Yet the troops had to employ draws whenever possible to outflank Japanese ridgeline strongpoints, and often draws and ravines proved to be only routes from which tanks, tank destroyers, and canopy company self-propelled mounts could get to the front to fire against Japanese cave positions along the sides of the ridges. The capture of one Japanese-held cave served only to disclose another, and one machine gun position was overrun only to provide access to the next. Dislodging the Kembo group from such defenses in depth was to prove a slow and laborious and costly process, demanding the closest teamwork between the infantry and its supporting arms. Casualties, as a rule, would not be heavy on any one day. Progress was to be slow, and the troops would spend too much of their time pinned down and awaiting fire from supporting weapons. But a daily attrition rate of about 5 men killed and 15 wounded for each battalion engaged would soon begin to have its effect. Meanwhile, the 160th Regiment swiftly captured Hills 636 and 600 in rapid succession. However, the 108th Regiment lost control of Hill G during the engagement. On January the 26th, Griswold committed the 37th Division to the fight, with the 145th Regiment successfully capturing Mabalacat and Mabalacat East Airfield. Then they shifted westwards across Route 3, overrunning Clark Field Runway No. 1. In the Cabarin Hills, American forces gained only 150 yards at a considerable cost. In response, Patrick decided to deploy another battalion from the 1st Regiment to eliminate the pocket of resistance. The following day, this 2-battalion assault proved successful, resulting in the destruction of an entire battalion of Japanese troops, with over 1,400 enemy soldiers killed. Further north, the 161st Regiment finally broke through the main defenses of the Shigemi's forces. Before dawn, most of the Japanese left San Manuel scrambling across the draw on the east side of the town, and they fled to join the 10th Reconnaissance Regiment north of San Nicolas, but not before launching a final counterattack to cover their escape. At about 9:30, the 161st Infantry's 2 battalions resumed their drive southwards through the town, and by 1:30, San Manuel was finally clear. In a heroic but tactically unimportant stand, the Shigemi detachment had virtually fulfilled its self-imposed desire for annihilation in place. The detachment had lost 750 men killed. All of its tanks, artillery trucks, machine guns, and motors had been either captured or destroyed. Probably no more than 250 troops escaped. Many of them were unarmed and wounded. The 161st Infantry and attached units had lost approximately 60 men killed and 200 wounded. The 716th Tank Battalion had lost 3 tanks. Meanwhile, Wing's offensive continued on January the 27th, with the 103rd Regiment successfully reaching the crest of Hill 700 and the northwestern slopes of Hill 600. Unfortunately, they lost both positions to a brutal Japanese counterattack amidst a violent tropical downpour. On January the 28th, the 172nd Regiment captured Rosario, while the 63rd secured the southern crest of Hill 1500. Both regiments completed the capture of this strategic feature by January the 30th, thereby finalizing the occupation of the crucial road junction area. Further south, on January the 27th, the 160th Regiment advanced only 500 to 800 yards to the west and southwest. The 108th Regiment made a more substantial advance of about 1,000 yards southwest from Hills E and G, but failed to reach Hill 5. The 145th Regiment pushed south along Route 3 for an additional 3 miles, reaching Calo and DOW before taking control of the guerrilla-occupied Angeles, which had recently been abandoned by the retreating Yanagimoto detachment. In a similar vein, the 148th Regiment secured Magaling without encountering any resistance. Yet now I want to shift our attention towards Burma, where we will delve into the ongoing developments of Operation Capital. Picking up from our previous episode, we find ourselves in central Burma, where the 2nd British Division and the 19th Indian Division are making significant strides towards Shweo. The 2nd British Division successfully captured Shweo on January the 2nd, followed by the establishment of a crucial bridgehead across the Mu River just 3 days later. Meanwhile, the 19th Indian Division also advanced, reaching Shweo by January the 5th. On January the 8th, a coordinated assault was launched by units from both divisions, culminating in the capture of Shweo after 2 days of intense and brutal combat. Over to the west, General Festing's 29th Brigade also began probing the northern flank of the 15th Division at Twingji. Concurrently, other elements of the 19th Division worked to solidify their positions by establishing additional bridgeheads over the Irrawaddy River, At places like Thibekin and Kwakyang. On January the 10th, the 20th Indian Division captured Budalen and subsequently pushed towards Manhwa, where the 33rd Division only had left a small contingent to serve as a rearguard. However, the campaign faced unexpected challenges. Heavy rainfall during the first week of January brought all transport operations of the 4th Corps to a standstill, significantly hampering the Lushai Brigade's planned assault on Ganga. After enduring a heavy aerial bombardment, the attack on Ganga finally commenced on January the 10th. The Lushai Brigade managed to overpower the limited defensive forces there, forcing them to retreat after a brief skirmish. With Ganga now under their control, the Lushai Brigade refocused their efforts on reconnaissance, monitoring the flanks of the 7th Indian Division. Meanwhile, the 28th East African Brigade took the lead in the advance, successfully displacing a Japanese garrison on Tiling on January the 22nd. By this time, the 114th Brigade had begun to follow in the wake of the East Africans, while the 89th Brigade executed a long maneuver to the left, advancing towards Pak in parallel with the other offensives. Although General Kimura was aware of some of these movements on the southern flank, he perceived them as mere feints by minor forces intended to divert his attention southwards. Following a relentless barrage of artillery and aerial strikes, the 20th Division launched its offensive against Manhwa on January the 20th. This assault faced fierce resistance, and it took 2 days of intense and bloody combat before the division was able to secure control of the town. After capturing Manhwa, the 80th Brigade advanced towards Myang, while the 110th Brigade shifted its focus to Ayada before launching an attack on Minmu. By January the 25th, they had successfully established a bridgehead in that area. Meanwhile, to the east, the 2nd Division commenced its assault on Sagang on January the 14th. They made significant headway against the forward defenses of the 31st Division, while other units managed to secure a bridgehead at Yoatigi. General Katamura, concerned about the expanding bridgeheads established by the 19th Division across the Irrawaddy River, ordered the 15th and 53rd Divisions to neutralize these positions before they could become fortified. As a result, during the last week of January, the Japanese forces executed a series of coordinated night attacks upon Kwakyang. By this time, British Indian troops had dug in deeply, supported by formidable artillery and machine gun positions. The ensuing conflict was marked by brutal carnage, with the 15th Division suffering a staggering loss of 1/3 of its personnel, while the 53rd Division was compelled to withdraw to Kyaksi after incurring heavy casualties. In parallel, the 89th Brigade successfully occupied Pak on January the 28th, as General Meservi's forces geared up for a decisive push towards Miktila. Looking northwards, General Sultan was advancing his own offensive aimed at reopening the Burma Road to China. He ordered the 50th Chinese Division to move towards Lashio, and he deployed the Mars Task Force to Hosi. Additionally, he dispatched the 36th British Division towards Mongmit, although the British advance was expected to be quite slow until additional forces could be brought into alignment for a more coordinated effort. General Sun's newly established First Army initiated a delayed offensive against Nam Kam, which resumed in early January. This resurgence was marked by the 90th Regiment's strategic capture of a hill that overlooks the southwestern entrance to the Shweo River Valley. Concurrently, the 112th Regiment advanced through Lo Wing, subsequently crossing the river to approach Nam Kam from the northeast. Meanwhile, the 88th Regiment entered the valley via the main road, making a direct push across the small plain towards Nam Kam. The 89th and 114th Regiments executed a broader maneuver around the southern end of the Shweo Valley. The 89th crossed the river on January the 7th and advanced northwards towards Nam Kam, while the 114th crossed 3 days later, navigating through the hills towards the Nam Kam-Nampaka Trail. To the south, the 475th Regiment progressed through Monghak and reached Mongwi on January the 6th, preparing for another challenging march across the hilly terrain towards Hosi, while the 124th Cavalry Regiment followed closely behind. It was so close to Tonghua, to the mountains, that the 475th found the trail rising steeply on the first day's march east. Like a crazily twisted drill, it bordered its way east and ever higher. In some places it was 15 to 20 feet across, in others just wide enough for a man or a mule. As he rounded the turns, the men would peer ahead and look across the valleys to where lay rows upon rows of hills. Trees were everywhere. In flat places carved by erosion, the Burmese had cut and farmed terraces, and little villages clung to the mountains like limpets to a rock. Because existing maps were unreliable, so that map reconnaissance could not locate water and bivouac areas, and because the sheer fatigue of climbing the steeper slopes was formidable, march schedules went down the mountainside, with quite a few steel helmets and an occasional mule. Halts were a matter of common sense, leadership at platoon or company level. The march was tactical, but no Japanese were encountered. though rumor of their nearness kept the men alert. The Chinese had passed that way before, while a screen of Kachin Rangers was preceding the American columns. Speaking the local dialects and carrying radios and automatic weapons, the Kachins were an excellent screen, which masked the Mars Task Force while reporting anything that might be suspicious. Despite the difficult march, crossing the 400-foot wide Shweo was not too hard. The bridge built by the Chinese some weeks before still stood, a triumph of Oriental ingenuity, with bundles of bamboo for pontoons and vines for cable. The Shweo was beginning to tear itself apart, but work parties from the 475th kept it operable. Meanwhile, spurred into action by General Wendemeyer, after a month of inactivity, General WWII Force finally resumed its offensive operations in late December. They promptly dispatched the 2nd, 6th, and 71st Armies to launch an assault on the forward positions of the 56th Division at Wanting. Simultaneously, the 53rd Army executed a wide flanking maneuver to the west, aiming to encircle and attack the Japanese forces from the rear. Faced with the intense pressure of this four-pronged offensive, General Matsuyama was compelled to withdraw the 148th Regiment to a position north of Mongyu. He also ordered the Yoshida Force to mount a counter-offensive towards Moose, and committed the reserve 2nd Regiment to secure Nampaka. On January the 5th, the 53rd Army reached the vicinity of the Moose and began crossing the river. However, they were met with fierce resistance from Matsuyama's timely counterattack, which thwarted their advance. 10 days later, Sun's forces initiated a well-coordinated offensive against Namkham, which ultimately succumbed on January the 16th as the 55th Regiment retreated towards Konung. With the Shweo Valley now firmly under Allied control, Matsuyama began to tighten his defensive perimeter in anticipation of the final withdrawal towards Husui. On January the 17th, the Mars Task Force made significant progress by reaching the Hosi sector, where they immediately engaged Japanese outposts. The 475th Regiment successfully secured the advantageous high ground near Namkham village. Over the next 2 days, American forces clashed with the 4th Regiment, capturing the strategically important Lokang Ridge and the elevated terrain overlooking Nampaka. On January the 19th, the Mars Task Force attempted to disrupt the Japanese supply lines by blocking the Burma Road through demolition artillery bombardment, coinciding with the arrival of the 55th Regiment, which was sent to bolster its defenders. In a parallel effort, the 114th Regiment managed to sever the Namkham-Nampaka Trail at the Lolan on the same day. Faced with this escalating threat from the south and the intensifying Chinese assaults upon Wanting, the 56th Division was compelled to further contract its defensive perimeter. As a result, Wanting fell on January the 20th. Unfortunately for Matsuyama, General Wei received orders from the Generalissimo to conclude the Salween campaign immediately, which meant that the Chinese forces would remain in their positions until they could be relieved by Sultan's units. Over the course of nearly 9 months of intense combat, Wei's Y Force had successfully reoccupied an impressive 24,000 square miles of Chinese territory and had defeated one of the most elite divisions of the Japanese army, along with elements from 2 additional divisions. However, the fighting was far from over. Sun continued to dispatch the 112th and 113th Regiments towards Wanting and Mongyu, aiming to clear the final stretch of the road leading to China. Meanwhile, the 89th and 114th Regiments pressed eastwards to cut off the Burma Road, north of Nampaka, further complicating the situation for the Japanese forces. In the southern region, from January the 20th to the 24th, the Mars Task Force continued its strategic operations, executing ambushes and demolition missions while successfully repelling several intense counterattacks from enemy forces. By late January, pressure by the Mars Task Force and that of the Chinese forces in the north began to register on the Japanese. The soldiers of the 4th Regiment could see the aerial activity that kept Mars supplied. Not recognizing what they saw, they were so impressed by a big supply drop on the 24th that they had sent a report to the 56th Division of a large airborne force being landed along the Burma Road. Accepting this report, General Matsuyama decided to destroy his ammunition and retreat south. His superiors on January the 24th agreed to let him retreat, but only after he had evacuated casualties and ammunition. 40 vehicles with gasoline accompanied by Major Kibino of the 33rd Army Staff were sent north to support the 56th in its withdrawal. The Japanese truck convoy made its run north on the night of January the 24th. The trucks were heard and the Americans placed heavy fire upon the road. Kibino had been making the trip in a tankette. Hit by a 4.2-inch mortar shell, it burst into flames clearly visible from the American lines. Kibino clambered out, jumped on a truck, and succeeded in getting his convoy over to the 56th Division. The next day, the derelict tankette was credited to the 2nd Battalion, 475th Regiment. Encouraged by the additional supplies of gasoline and inspired by the heroic examples of Major Kibino, and the personnel of the truck companies, the 56th Division renewed its efforts and, during the next 4 days, effectively evacuated over 1,000 casualties and moved several tons of ammunition to Shweo. Meanwhile, General Matsuyama began to systematically reposition his forces towards Nampaka, a strategic maneuver that would enable Chinese troops to occupy Mangyu on January the 27th. In a broader context, by the end of January, the 36th and 50th Divisions were also engaged in crossing the Shweo River, preparing to advance their offensives further south. In the Arakan region, Operation Romulus exceeded expectations. The 1st Battalion of the 111th Regiment had been defending Akyab. On December the 31st, as the rear guard of the Sakura Detachment crossed the Calo River and moved eastwards, the battalion was ordered to withdraw to Ponegyin. As intelligence suggested, very few Japanese were left on Akyab Island. A recent airplane reported that the locals showed no anxiety. On January the 2nd, messages were dropped in Urdu and to the Burmese asking them to sit on the ground if the island was still occupied or stand with their heads up in the air if not. Captain Jimmy Jarrett of Sea Flight 656 AOP Squadron then landed to a rousing reception and found the Japanese had quit on December the 31st, although nobody believed him until a senior officer flew in to confirm it. This prompted General Christensen to swiftly initiate an amphibious invasion. Notably, this operation was executed without the anticipated naval bombardment and without deploying the reserve 26th Indian Division. As a result, the 3rd Commando Brigade successfully captured Akyab on January the 3rd, facing absolutely no resistance. The 25th Indian Division soon followed, reinforcing the area. From Akyab, the 9th York and Lancasters were transported by boat to establish a strategic blockade along the Yo River at Ponegyin. There they encountered a significant Japanese force. After a fierce engagement, however, the Japanese defenders were compelled to retreat towards Monghang by January the 11th. In response to the evolving situation, Admiral Malban devised a plan to land the 3rd Commando Brigade and the 25th Division on the Mobon Peninsula. This operation aimed to sever the primary lines of communication for Japanese forces, while preparations were being made for the 26th Division to conduct a landing on Ramri Island. A little sidestep here, but there is a very notable myth about Ramri Island during World War II. Some of you Pacific War enthusiasts might have heard this legendary account of how 1,000 Japanese were eaten by saltwater crocodiles. Well, I don't want to give away the actual story, but if you're interested, I did a very thorough investigation into what is called the Ramri Island Massacre. I don't want to boast, but I don't think anybody else on YouTube has ever actually told the real story. If you go over on YouTube, check out the Pacific War channel. I have a YouTube episode on it and a longer form podcast, but I do recommend the YouTube episode because it's pretty entertaining. Back to the story. In response to the urgent military situation, Operation Passport was swiftly conceived and executed on January the 12th. British Indian forces successfully landed on the southern tip of the peninsula, supported by both air and naval operations. Once ashore, the commandos advanced inland, facing intense resistance from fortified hill positions. Their efforts culminated in the capture of Pagona Hill, the village of Maibon. However, as they pushed forward, opposition intensified, making it increasingly difficult for British Indian troops to reach Hill 831. Simultaneously, the 82nd West African Division, now commanded by Major General Hugh Stockwell, entered the Caledon Valley to relieve the 81st Division, which had been engaged in combat for over a year. The West African forces began to apply pressure against the Matsu Detachment. These units were stationed at Mohang and Mimbia, although the Japanese forces managed to maintain their positions despite the mounting assaults. Meanwhile, planning was underway for the deployment of the 3rd Commando Brigade and the 51st Indian Brigade to land at Kaga, coinciding with General Lomax's invasion of Ramri Island. Early on January the 21st, the Naval Bombardment Group opened fire. Christensen and the other force commanders were watching through field glasses from a bridge upon the HMS Queen Elizabeth in her first engagement since the Dardanelles in 1915. Christensen later said, "Some shells fell in a marsh behind the Jap defenses, and I saw a number of duck spring up." "Duck," I shouted. "The Royal Navy never ducks." With her second salvo, the Queen Elizabeth scored a direct hit on a Japanese ammunition depot, which facilitated the landing operations. The 71st Indian Brigade successfully captured Kwapieu with minimal resistance. This victory enabled them to advance towards Miebien and Kwakyak, both of which would fall into their hands by January the 23rd. In the subsequent days, the brigade continued its advance towards the Yabakchang, where they encountered fierce Japanese defenses. At the same time, other elements of the division worked to secure Chiduba and Saigukyan Islands, further consolidating their strategic position in the region. On January 22nd, the commandos in the 51st Brigade successfully landed in the Ganga area near the Min River. However, they faced violent and frequent counterattacks from Japanese forces, which hindered their ability to expand their beachhead. Despite these challenges, the intense pressure from the commandos ultimately forced the Japanese defenders at Hill 831, Myeonghang, and Minbya to retreat towards Kani, marking a significant shift in the operational landscape. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and my newly titled podcast, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. I recommend checking out my episode on the myth of the Ramri Island Massacre. It's found both as a YouTube episode and as a podcast. If you'd like to further support me, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either, you get access to the exclusive podcast, early access to all of my content, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. General Kruger's forces advanced against Japanese defenses, capturing key positions despite heavy resistance and casualties. Meanwhile in Burma, British Indian troops advanced seizing key locations despite heavy resistance. Both fronts faced intense combat, leading to significant territorial gains against Japanese forces by the end of January.